right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our first installment of our new Conversations with the Curator series. This will be a once-a-month lunch and learn style series that brings you behind the scenes of our collections and our exhibits. While the Sigel Museum has 3 floors of exhibits filled with artifacts like textiles, ceramics, and family heirlooms, our collections are also home to over 5,000 books, 10,000 manuscripts, 120,000 photographs, and a countless number of maps, architectural plans, and family histories. My name is Sarah White. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at NCHGS, and I am joined today by my colleague Tim Betts, our Curator of Exhibitions. Today, Tim will take us through our current exhibit here in the Schrin Gallery at Sigel, Forged by Fire, the Heroism, Honor, and History of Firefighting in Northampton County. Tim,
Hi, Sarah, and hi, everyone else.
When you were planning, you outlined Forged by Fire into some main sections, like 6 main themes. Can you walk us through what a visitor will experience when they first enter this exhibit?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing people will experience, and I think it kind of is an experience and was for us, is a hose wall, which is what we call it. And that's kind of literally what it is. It is a wall with over 30, nearly 40 fire hose hanging from it, which a fire hose is surprisingly easy to acquire. But really, that is to kind of set the stage for the exhibit. There is 6 thematic areas for it, though. And the way I was thinking about that is, if we're thinking of the history of firefighting in Northampton County, or really kind of the history of firefighting in this part of the United States, like that had a long history of European settlement in it, let's say, we're really talking about a history that goes from the 18th century to the present, right? And that's a lot of time. So we broke up the exhibit into 6 areas that are thematic and somewhat chronological, but mostly thematic. So the first one is this section that, let's call it fire prevention. Right. Fire stories and, cooking the hunt and all of these various things, right? But the thing about it, and I think the important thing to remember, is that fire is 2 things for us as humans, right? Fire is life. You need it to live. And you need it to cook food. You need it to keep warm in the winter. Fire is also death, right? Like, fire is something that can cause destruction when it's out of control. So in thinking about all this, we have to think about fire prevention. And I'm thinking about that, and the exhibit is thinking about it in really 2 ways. It is thinking about it as, here is fire extinguishers, and this is how they work, right? Like, there are different kinds of fire extinguishers. This is how they evolve from, like, one of my favorite things, this like glass ball filled with a liquid that you'd literally, like, if there was a fire, you'd literally take it and you chuck it at a fire, right? Like, every time I pick it up, which isn't often these days, I just want to, like, throw it at a fire because it seems like it'd be really kind of fun to do, to like evolving to our modern fire extinguishers. But I think the really kind of interesting and compelling part about that is other things that go along with the idea of prevention of fire. That is anywhere from, like, fire insurance and the development of fire insurance, anywhere from urban planning, right? We have a little bit where we're talking about, like, this is how Benjamin Franklin viewed the development of Philadelphia, and really kind of as, well, not Benjamin Franklin, this is how William Penn thought of the development of Philadelphia. And then, you leave these open spaces and trees so that the houses wouldn't catch on fire. And then ultimately how Franklin saw that and created what we would think of as fire insurance, right? He insures homes, and kind of one of my favorite little stories from that moment is, there's houses that have trees next to them, because that's what houses do. And Franklin doesn't want to insure houses with trees by them because he says that's an increased fire risk. Lightning can hit the tree, house can catch on fire. Eventually Franklin realizes, because Franklin is very much of his time, but also this very, like, exceptionally modern person for the 18th century, right? He realizes that he can do this thing, which is
Mhm.
charge people more if there's a greater insurance risk. And he does that. So people with trees start paying a little bit more, right? Which is interesting. So fire prevention, anything from fire extinguishers to insurance to the Moravians pumping water out of the river up to their settlement in Bethlehem, which they are then using for the infrastructure, right? For
Mhm.
drinking water, for water to use, and for water for fighting fires. The next kind of section is broadly community, right? Like the idea of community, which again, think about it in two different ways, right? Like community is something firefighters throughout history protect, right? So part of that is how you let communities know there is a fire, communication, right? That showing this kind of evolution from shouting fire and ringing a church bell to like modern things like beepers. Midway in through there is one of my favorite parts of the exhibit, which is this thing called the Gamewell alarm system, which is a telegraph system that allowed people to pinpoint where fires were. You know, there's boxes on the street, you pull the alarm and a telegraph goes in central station, and that says the fire is at this near this box, and then they can dispatch to it, right? So really kind of the development of technology to become like, you know, how we would think of it now. You can pinpoint where a fire is. The other aspect of community is the community that forms in a firehouse, right? The idea of these companies having civic pride, the idea of these companies having pride in themselves. This is, of course, like in the 19th century where we're seeing this kind of national rise of like fraternal organizations, right? So this is where we're talking about parades. And I think kind of the real hallmark artifact of that is our newly acquired and newly restored banner from the Dewey Fire Company in Hellertown. Many fire companies had these really kind of elaborate banners that they would take to parades, right? And as this way of showing pride in themselves and their organization. The Dewey Fire Company banner is this beautiful thing that has gilded text on it and a portrait of Admiral Dewey, right? Who he is this American naval admiral, and he has this decisive victory of the Battle of Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War. And the Dewey Fire Company at the time that's happening named themselves after him, right? As this kind of like modern American, well, their modern American hero. The other kind of community organization that we'll touch on a little bit again later on, probably I'd imagine, because it's me, is the Humane Fire Company of Easton. They're starting in 1797, and they are kind of like ultimately the volunteer fire company for like the longer history of this that we really kind of are delving into, right?
Mhm.
The next kind of stage is the Industrial Revolution or industrialization, right? As cities get larger, right? In the 19th century, we're seeing this explosion of population in part through like 19th century immigration booms. We're seeing cities become larger and larger, buildings become taller and taller. We're seeing the rise of industry, large industry, right? Like silk mills and factories and all of these things kind of throughout the Lehigh Valley, Bethlehem Steel, right? These large things, both large cities and large industry, mean fire problems,
Mhm.
right? Many of these large industries like Bethlehem Steel would have their own fire company. And then there's also this like specter, right? That like as things get bigger, there's more possibilities for tragedy to happen in a fire, right? And like the kind of specter of all of that that I think is kind of really important to consider is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, right? Where like in a world without like fire codes or OSHA regulations or any sort of things, you know, like 19th century, there is none of those. Early 20th century, there's none of those. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York catches on fire, and over 100 women die because they can't leave, right? They can't get out. This kind of horrific moment in American history that it's this like, we need to do something about that. And the thing we do about it is fire drills, right? Fire egress. Across from that, kind of thematically out of that a little bit, is a try-on station, right? Where we can adults and children, because I think like adults doing these things is important too, can try on like a fire, you know, some of a fireman's turnout gear and see how heavy it is. The answer is really heavy. And my kind of other little favorite part in that is we have a TV setup that is running 90s fire PSAs, which are like a insect crystallized in amber, right? They're kind of a very specific time. And then kind of getting into the part of the exhibit that's like right behind you there, right? The idea of firefighters as first responders, right? And the idea of the community is also playing a part in that. The community playing a part in that coming in through things like the rise of civil defense after World War II, or during World War II and then after, really kind of the idea that protecting communities from fire was a community job. And really kind of the standout thing from there, I think, is that bright yellow thing behind you next to that really big poster, which is a Geiger counter, right? It is this post-World War II reality of the kind of constant threat of nuclear annihilation and how that was something that had to be considered as well, right? In there too is the idea that like if there's a car accident, very often the first people that reach that accident are firefighters. So they have like the equipment to extract someone from a car, right? The jaws of life, as we call it, right? They have defibrillators and all these sorts of things, because very often, and I've noticed this as I've been like giving more and more tours of this exhibit to like people that live in like retirement communities or stuff like that. I've had a lot of people say like, oh yeah, when there is a medical emergency, the fire company shows up first. And that's kind of really, really interesting to me, kind of in the swing of this exhibit. The other element of that is the idea of mutual aid, right? Which the kind of thematic thing that gets you into that is artifacts from the World Trade Center from 9/11, boots, a helmet, a piece of terrazzo marble, and a nozzle. Because 9/11 is like the largest firefighter story of, this whole sweep of history, right? It's this kind of turning point of the modern world, but it's also this moment of mutual aid, right? There is this massive mobilization of people going to lower Manhattan from kind of a broader tri-state area, right? But then mutual aid is something that happens on, I don't want to say a smaller scale, but on a local scale, right? So this exhibit goes to the May 2023 Ferry Street fire here in Easton, which mobilized fire departments from across the river in New Jersey, from several different counties that kind of descended on that Memorial Day weekend. The thing about that I think is important to note, like mutual aid is something that's codified now, right? It's something that's part of this world, right? But like this was something that had happened historically, right? There's all these stories of like large fires in Easton, large fires in Phillipsburg, right across the river. And like in the minutes of the fire company, at the Humane Fire Company, which are fun because they're all like arguing with each other, but they'll be like, this fire happened in Phillipsburg and we went, right? And it's like, that's like 1870 and it's still mutual aid, right? So it's like this kind of mutual use of resources is kind of a longer history. The other part about that, kind of going around there to kind of finally get through the entire thing, is what we call affectionately the tool wall, which is anything from fireman turnout gear to Halligan bar, a kind of multi-purpose tool that you can use on a fire. My favorite part of that, I don't know if I should have a favorite, but they're all wonderful. But my favorite part of that is it's called foam generator. It's this big red thing. It's like a big red cone, and you screw a hose into one end, and then you screw a hose into the other end, and then you pour a can of foam into it. And it's like best not to think about what's in the foam, but you pour the can of foam into that, and then that acts as a fire retardant agent. But it's just this really great, very mid 20th century looking bright red thing, right? And it's really like showing this important technological aspect. So like those 7 things, and I realized I kind of like wove in a little bit of like storytelling and all there. So it's like the idea of fire prevention, whatever that would mean, right? Like stopping fires, making sure fires are something that don't happen, invoking all sorts of things, anywhere from insurance. There's an element in there of Pennsylvania German folklore, kind of thinking about these things, community, the idea of industrialization and the problems that happens, essentially like the modern world and how that changes firefighting, firefighters, first responder, the Tryon station, which is kind of its own thing, but kind of counting it in there, and then tools, like those tools of the trade. So that's that's kind of walking through anyway.
Yeah, and it's neat because it's like a tiny microcosm of the field in general, because you think you have these ideas of what you want to talk about, but then you find out that now you're pulling this idea, now you're pulling this idea, and that you can't talk about one specific theme without also talking about the broader experience
You
within
really
all
can't.
of those themes.
You really can't. And I think it's interesting because like when I first started working on, like I'm new to this job, right? Like I started in April, I'm coming up on my 1 year, surprisingly. But I started in April last year, and like day one was this firefighting exhibit is happening, go for it, right? And like going in, I was like, okay, this will be like an interesting to do, right? There's all sorts of like interesting stories that can tell that, but like the deeper you delve into it, it does get to the kind of the problem of my like little tour of it is that this is not just a firefighting story, right? It's not just about like houses catching on fire. There are so many intertwined little, not little, like large narratives
Mm.
in that, right? Like community and what that means, technology, the role that these organizations play in our community, right? The thing I didn't mention is like volunteerism, right? Like fundraising, uh, mental health services, right? Like all of these, there's all of these different stories. And like it's ultimately like a story of firefighting, but it's also ultimately this exceptionally human story, right? Like, and I think that's what like there's like elements of it that are very compelling, but I think like thinking about this is like it's very human, right? Because very often I think if you're encountering like I've met so many like wonderful firefighters, and I see there's there's all sorts of people that I've met, right? But like usually like regular people, when they'll meet firefighters, are meeting them like on the worst day of their life, right? Like their
Ah.
house is on fire, right? So it's like that's very human, and it's very human that like there are people in the community who are, because it's dangerous work, right? It's people, firefighters die, and I think it's very this human humbling thing that people like are willing to sacrifice and do that, right? So yeah, and there's a lot that goes into it, I think.
Yeah, quite a bit. And one of the things that NCHGS is doing more broadly throughout all of our exhibits is really trying to make them more visitor friendly, more interactive. And you mentioned the try-on station, which I think is great because I see folks interact with it all the time. But I know there are other things throughout Forged by Fire that visitors can touch and try out. Um, there's that, I'm not quite sure what you call it, the log.
We call it the boring station,
Oh,
which
oh.
it's more exciting than that. It's not boring at all. I mean, it is boring. It's a kind of boring because what it is it is talking about log pipes, right?
Mm.
Pipes like the Moravian Waterworks pipes, kind of pipes that were water mains in cities until like some of them really recently. Like there's pictures of like mid like like in the 20s in
Mm.
various cities, them removing water pipes from like these wood water pipes because they're like big logs, right? But the boring station is simulating what it would be like to use an 18th century tool like a
Mm.
drill and drill into a log. And the short of it is it's not fun. But I recommend people try it because it really kind of gets you in that that this is something you would do. You would be drilling through this, right? So there's that. Uh, the game well is semi-interactive, I think, kind of just kind of going around the thing. The game well is the alarm system. You pull the thing and it rings a bell and a telegraph goes through and it says where the station is. That is like, that we really kind of just do it like on tours. If anyone is in here and comes and wants to see it and it's a Thursday or a Friday, let Sarah know and I'll come down and make it work for you. I guess that's to say. But yeah, that's cool to see. The try-on station, you're trying stuff on and you're kind of experiencing the weight of these things. And then we have a interactive that is a different hoses with couplings, right? And the thought is, how do you, screw these hoses into the various couplings? And the short of it is hard, right? Like it's kind of like a motion that most people aren't used to. It's a lot bigger and a lot more unwieldy than like a garden hose, though like admittedly I always have trouble with garden hoses too. But like really ultimately it is to get your hands in it. I'm like very interested in the idea of like history is something that you're interacting with, right? Like you're getting your hands like and experiencing what it felt like to do these things, right? So I think like interactives like that, like even if it's like boring and doing,
Yeah.
doing a boring thing, they're important because it's like, oh, this is like work someone does or did, right? Like this is what it kind of would feel like. And it's of course in a very controlled situation, but
So with all of these moving pieces and all these rabbit holes that you've gone into, can you tell us what the process of planning and research looked like for you in this exhibit? Like that creative process, getting everything in order, and trying to make this exhibit into something that told the whole story. I'm not quite sure the word I'm going for, but in
I
a
know,
comprehensive
I know the
fashion.
general vibes you
Yeah.
mean. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the short of it is this was an intimidating project, right? Because it is it's a big story, right? It's over centuries of time. There's a lot of people involved in a lot of different places. There is, kind of this, there's a lot. And ultimately to tell the whole story of it, you need a bigger space than we have, right? Like you need like a really big museum to do it in. And like even then, like that would still be hard, right? So like the first that made it, I think, possible is like because it's like again, I'm coming in as someone, it's like I'm familiar with Pennsylvania and like this part of Pennsylvania, but like I am newly learning Northampton County history. So it's like the first with that, it's like there's this like challenge of learning where stuff is, and in the case of some places, how to say the name of that place, like Penargil. The other element of it is like that work of kind of really knowing where to look and like kind of do a lot of work. Like none of that's really possible without like the kind of unseen element of this, which is like our library volunteers, right? Who are kind of like constantly in the library, aiding people with like genealogical work. Our library is a working library, right? People come and can research their families or really kind of any questions they have. So like that major work, our interns, I see Emma is here. Emma did so much with this and laughed about my hi Emma,
Hi,
and
Emma.
just laughed so much about my like color choices. But yeah, so it's like that work because it's like when you see an exhibit in a museum, you're seeing just like the little tip of it, right? Like you're seeing the stuff that gets in, but there's so much there that's not there, right? Like there's so much research that goes in. I think part of it is this kind of there are stories that we definitely wanted to tell, right? There are stories and themes that we wanted to hit, and by we, I mean like the team that was working on it, myself, our curator of collections, Monica Bugby, our kind of like internal discussions, right, of like themes we wanted to talk about. Part of all of that, like those creative decisions and the curatorial decisions of it, those are based in part on the objects, right? Because there's objects in our collection. But like a large chunk of this exhibit is objects that are either on loan from fire companies throughout the county. So we did kind of a large call out for what do you have, right? So there's a chunk of that is that, so it's on loan, and another chunk of the loans are on loan from a private collector, right? So it's like who has this kind of astounding collection of local firefighting things. It's like a lot of that creative work. It's like the stories we want to tell and the objects we have, and that kind of dictated it, right? So yeah, I'd say it's really kind of it starts off super really large, and then it kind of collapses in on itself and it's still really large. I think like my kind of personal research project with it was because it's like again, I'm like learning the local history in addition to doing that. I used Easton's Humane Fire Company as kind of like my doorway in,
Mm.
right? So like other versions of, and in part that's kind of based on our collection. We have a lot of things from the East, like Easton's history, right? So like the Humane was a good choice. We have their meeting minutes, all that. But in part, it's like one organization I could kind of track because it's this like history from like the 18th century to the late 19th, and then it becomes the paid company of Easton,
Mm.
right? But it's like kind of really picking something to delve into and
Mm.
then out, right? If that makes sense. But it is a process, right? Like this Forged by Fire, I mean, like it was being worked on before I joined the team in April. I mean, like from April through September, there were choices being made. I mean, there were like some late object additions that were added after the opening, right? So like in like the end of September, there were like one or two more things. So yeah, it's like a project. And I always think like there's a thing that people say, like I went to art school, so I always think about like art stuff. Like art is not done, like art is not finished, it's only abandoned, right? Like it's done and then you can always work more, right?
Mm.
And that's kind of what an exhibit is. I'm not saying I abandoned Forged by Fire, but it's not, there's more, like there's so much more, right, that could be
Right.
there.
And speaking of how so much of it is based around objects, I won't get into this too much because I know we're very, very excited for next month's conversation. But I don't think it's a leap to say that our favorite, I don't even want to call him an object.
It's
He's
really
so
weird
much
to
more
call
than
it
that.
an yeah.
Our favorite object is actually one that we don't have. So can you give us just a little bit
Yeah,
of what we're going to talk about next month?
the one that got away.
Yes.
The goodest boy, Frank the fire dog from the Humane Fire Company, a dog so great that he was trained to urinate out small fires in the fire department of the Humane, was taxidermied, and then the hunt continued. So like that's a little bit of a, taxidermy dog next month, I guess. Yeah, the one that got away. Truly the one that got away. But I think he's interesting for a wide variety of reasons. And a good boy.
Yes, the bestest, the
Yeah.
bestest boy.
Yeah.
And I love so much about this story, but I think one of the things that really sticks with me is that it really underlines just how much we're talking about real people who just loved their dog.
Yeah. And I think that's super important, right? Because we'll talk about that a little more. I don't want to give too much of Frank away, right?
Right,
But
right,
like
right, right.
what I love about him and like what I love about kind of finding these human stories about like people that love their dog, right? Like I have two dogs and I'm like obsessed by them, except like
Yeah,
when they get me up at like 4:30 in the morning, but it is what it is.
as they do.
It's a thing you sign up for, right? But like I think very often we think about these people of the past, right? Like of the 19th century, of before that, right? And we think of them as like these are serious people in like photographs, and like partly they look like that because they're like longer exposure time or stuff like that. But like they're people and they're doing like weird people things, but they're also doing like brave things. Some of them are doing, you know, they're doing whatever they do, whatever we do, right? And I think that like as like a historian and like as someone that's like as a curator, it's my job to like research the past and then like present the past and kind of like present the past to the public in a way that the public can like ask questions of the past and kind of interact with the past. Like I think that's like the most important thing to remember, right? Like that any of these people, like these firemen of the Humane that loved Frank, like they were people, right? And that's important.
So definitely tune in next month as we go into a deep dive of what it's like trying to search for an object that you maybe have if you're lucky, a breadcrumb trail to go off of.
I still have hope though. Still have hope we'll find them.
Never give up hope.
No.
Frank deserves it. Right. Does anyone have any questions for Tim before we head out for the afternoon? No? Anyone? Anyone? If you haven't come in to see Forged by Fire, it will be up until July 7th,
After Heritage Day.
Heritage Day.
And then other things are coming. I'll be cagey about what that is, but something will
Yes.
come after.
Something will come after,
Mhm.
as history does.
Indeed.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you to everyone so much for coming in. As a reminder, you do not need to register in advance for these programs. So next month we'll have the Zoom link up on the website just as we did for this month. So if you know anybody that would like to tune in, just send them the link. You don't need to do anything ahead of time, but just log on in. And we will see you all next month, which will be February 28th, Wednesday, February 28th at noon, to talk about the goodest boy, Frank the Fire Dog.
That ever was.
The best.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.